Good morning and welcome to today's Wired briefing, Fighting Climate Change with Technology. I'm Greg Williams, Deputy Editorial Director of Wired. We are extremely glad you joined us this morning for what should prove to be a timely and thought-provoking session. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by three speakers to discuss the trends and innovations driving growth in climate tech and how breakthrough technologies can be used as tangible drivers of change. Leo Johnson is the Head of Disruption at Net Zero Innovation at PwC. Mikela Druckman is the CEO and co-founder of Greyparrot, an automated waste monitoring company that uses artificial intelligence to analyze large waste flows, which improves recycling systems across the world. And Selina Good is Marketing Manager at Carbonate Systems, the technology company working to treat industrial waste and contaminated soil to produce carbon-negative construction materials. Welcome all, great to have you with us this morning. So to kick off, I think it'll be really great to get the perspective of the two people who are driving change through their startups and understand a little bit about their experience of where we are with the climate tech ecosystem. So Mikela and Selina, please can you offer us an overview of your startups and share some of the key stages in your journey thus far. So maybe Mikela, you can kick us off if you don't mind, please. Thank you.
Sure. Hi everyone, great to be here today. So for a bit of context, as mentioned, we are providing AI solutions for the waste management sector. And so concretely what we do is that we place camera systems on top of moving conveyor belts. We analyze the material flow, 50 plus materials, analyze the composition and report that in real time. And that really allows those facilities to be much more efficient. It allows to create a more transparent commodity market for those very valuable resources, and also allows policy making and more transparency in the sector. And so we started the company 3 years ago, early 2019. And, we were really at a starting point looking at the problem of waste at a very large scale. So, we produce 2 billion tons of solid waste per year. 60% of that is going to go to landfill, 14% recycling only, and of course, huge environmental impact. And so we're trying to get our heads around, okay, where do we start? Where do we start solving the problem? And so our first stage was really to go and do a lot of iteration across the value chain of waste, from what are the consumers thinking, what are the municipalities thinking, and what is the waste management industry thinking? And what we noticed is that there's a huge lack of data alongside the value chain of waste. And this is the first problem that we decided to tackle. So we did a lot of prototyping and then essentially got to our first MVP, minimum viable product, as we call it, which allowed us to go to market and test that with customers and see if that, that was interesting to them. So I would say that was really the first big milestone. We then were able to close our first customer after a year. So that's always a very exciting stage of a company. And that's really where we hit what we call product market fit. So meaning that we are proposing a product for the market and there's genuinely a demand for it and we're solving an important problem. And from there on, we went into really technology development. So we raised our seed round at that point, and we continue building the product. So collecting a lot of data, developing the technology. So this is kind of really the technology phase. And we've now reached commercial stage with our technology, meaning that we can replicate the same solutions to hundreds of facilities. And I would say that's kind of another very big milestone before entering commercial scale. So brief overview, and happy to kind of dive into more details around that later as well.
Great, looking forward to digging into that. Thanks, Mikela. Selina, would you like to tell us a little bit about your journey now, please?
Of course, and thanks so much for having us. And Mikela, it's amazing to hear some of your insights as well. So Carbonate Systems is a CCUS scale-up company. And what we effectively do is we help our clients in the hard-to-abate sectors address two core sustainability issues, one of them being carbon capture, and the second being valorizing their industrial residues. And we developed technology that's actually able to use the carbon that's directly captured on site to treat those industrial residues. And in the process, manufacture low carbon and carbon negative building materials. So effectively realizing the circular economy. And that's what we do in a short summary, but how did we get here? Interestingly, actually, our story starts about 20 years ago. And that's when our co-founders really started doing initial research into how carbonation and mineralization could work. So effectively in the start, there was a huge focus on developing the technology. How do you prove this? How do you make it market relevant? And then at that point, still being full-time academics. Looking more recently, the key pivotal moment for us was definitely in 2018. And that's where we developed what we call our CO2 container, containerized system, which effectively houses the technology in 2 40-foot containers, making it a mobile and modular CCUS solution. And that's really when we look at how this can be scaled and commercialized in a global space. And so in 2018, we actually did our first pilot as well with a cement plant in CRH in Ontario. And then the year after, another pilot in the UK. And the year after, in 2020, that really led on to our first commercial deployment in France. And that's a short summary. Again, happy to look into some of that in more detail, but that's how we got to where we are today.
Great, thank you, Selina. So interesting to hear both of you talk about this importance of product market fit, commercialization and scaling of your products. Leo, if I can come to you now, please, because you've got kind of an overview of much of what's happening within the ecosystem. So I just came back from Slush, one of Europe's biggest tech festivals, and what really was apparent to me was how many startups now that were there were working in the climate tech space, whether that's SaaS-focused companies aimed at enterprises or more consumer-driven sort of solutions. And we are seeing climate change and sustainability top of mind for startups, large organizations in both the private and public sectors. I guess my question is, like, we've got so much kind of momentum after COP. How do we make sure that that isn't lost and that the ecosystem continues to really grow?
Yeah, always brilliant to be here. And so listening to Selina and Mikela, like, it's such a great way to start the morning, to get your optimism way up. And we really need it, with Omicron, with, Evergrande debt collapse in China, like, to see the type of innovation into a new territory of good growth, how do we build on this? That's exactly the question, Greg. And I think the first thing is to recognize the urgency of it. That if COP showed that the ratchet mechanism worked and we got down to 2.4 degrees, that's still not enough. We still need clean tech, climate tech innovations to bend the emissions curve down. So, that's point one, and Glasgow agreed with that. I think the funding, clearly is an issue as well. So we're just launching next week our State of Climate Tech report, which looks at the dynamics of the climate tech funding. And what we see is that it's really skewed. Electric vehicles, for example, which are 3% of total emissions, the mobility space, they're getting 60% of the funding, which means that, and they need more, of course, but the carbon abatement potential of the type of innovations that Selina and Mikela is doing is enormous. And there's just not enough funding going into these really promising, scalable, commercially viable technologies with high impact. So I think that's another crucial piece of the puzzle.
Yeah, so I'd love to get Mikela and then Selina, maybe your views of what Leo's just said in terms of the maturity of the climate tech sort of funding ecosystem. We're seeing, as Leo points out, a lot of money piling into areas such as mobility, for instance. Are we still sort of focusing more on the low-hanging fruit rather than really sort of like thinking about how we fund sort of, really kind of innovative sort of solutions like the one that you're working on? Maybe, Mikela, if we speak to you first, please.
Yeah, so, there's definitely a lot more interest, intention, and, capital that's starting to be dedicated to climate technology or, impact technologies. But still, it's a hard transition because especially the venture capital money is kind of used to, software first technologies. And when you look at most of climate technologies, they will probably have an element of hardware, and they will be dealing with, complex industries that maybe move slower. And so all these elements make it, quote unquote, less attractive potentially. And I think that's still where the barriers are, and that needs to move very quickly. And I think the biggest difference that I think we're not seeing yet is that those industries that we're disrupting, like waste management, like construction, they have to move at a pace that is unprecedented to get to their goals and to get to net zero. And so, even if traditionally they haven't moved fast or haven't been that innovative, in the next 5 to 10 years, the change we need to see is so incredible that it's only with partnership with startups and a lot of investment that we're going to be able to move to that change. So I'm hopeful that we get to that transition, but I definitely believe there's still some barriers for climate tech technologies to be funded.
Yeah, so Selina, just following up on what Mikela says there, you're dealing with really quite hard sort of scientific problems. You're innovating in a kind of the physical space. Software companies are so used to just throwing engineers at a problem, right, and scaling it. Sort of, it's very straightforward. You guys are dealing with science, and you're dealing with kind of the physical world, which is tough sometimes for investors to get their heads around, because sometimes it's harder to understand where the actual return, when that might come. From your perspective and from what you've experienced, do you see that funding gap? Do you see that sort of like challenge for those entrepreneurs working in climate tech, that it's a bit harder to sort of get the attention of investors in a way that maybe, I don't know, a fintech, a neobank might already have a kind of a clear roadmap of how to get to where they want to be in terms of the capital they want to attract?
Definitely, and I second everything that Mikela said as well, is that it is a challenge that we see. That being said, to shift maybe to a more positive note as well, is we are starting to see that attention. I think there is a general acceptance now that we have to look at clean tech and climate tech companies, and then have to challenge, I guess, what that means for investment or the longevity of it. But that being said, there are clean tech companies out there that are economically viable today. And it takes that trust and that support from an investor to then almost reiterate that and prove that there is return on investment here. So yes, it's a new space, but there are real and ready solutions out there that can already do that.
So, Leo, just coming back to you for a second, for the kind of the overview, thinking very much about the report that's going to be released next week. Can you give us a sense of how important it's going to be for us, not just to focus on the existing technologies that we have in play at the moment and that we're using to sort of grow startups in various areas, but to achieve significant breakthroughs? How important are they going to be to really getting to where we need to be in the next 20, 30 years?
I think, as Selina said, the task is a big one. So it's a mountain. So we do a report called the Net Zero Economy Index, which shows that we got to decarbonize now at 12.9% a year on year till 2050, and we haven't averaged more than 2% since 2000. So we got to go 5 times faster. And the issue is net zero doesn't address that urgency. Net zero shunts commitments through space and time to 2050. And what we need are some radical carbon abatement technologies. We need megawatts as a focus, as well as, of course, as the just transition and to address the social challenges. And that's where I think some breakthrough technologies are absolutely crucial. And there's stuff that's right on the edge of doability, which is often mixing together bits of already proven technologies into an ecosystem that works, which I think are really exciting. And one of those might be, if you take the challenge of forestry, which came up within COP as a major potential breakthrough potential. There's a group that we've been talking to called Greyparrot that looks at the Brazilian rainforest and looks at a particular element of it, an area that's twice the size of Britain. It's about 10 million hectares of virgin forest, and it's trees there that are sequestering about 2.5 billion tons of carbon, but they're at risk from the loggers. And what this company Greyparrot does, it does a collaboration with a Kayapo indigenous community who live in the forest and who know the choke points where the loggers come in. And it uses satellite-based monitoring at high resolution of tree protection, continued afforestation, and it does a blockchain-based token payment for ecosystem services to the Kayapo to give them the resources to enable them to control the choke points and fight off the loggers. So it's that type of weaving together bits of proven technology, addressing the environmental as well as the social. That's the type of breakthrough technology that I think is really going to be urgent.
So I'm interested to understand and dig into a little bit more of the journey that both Greyparrot and Carbon8 have undergone, because I think there'll be a lot of entrepreneurs watching who'll be really intrigued to know sort of like how you move from that prototype to a pilot, to a product, to getting your first customer, as you both described. Maybe, if you don't mind, Mikela, can you just talk us a little bit through how that process worked for you, and what advice you'd have maybe for sort of some of the entrepreneurs watching?
Yeah, absolutely. And if I can just add one thing on the back of what Leo said as well is, there is a lot of proven technologies that have disrupted other sectors, and it's now about transferring them to other areas where, some of those very big challenges are at, like waste management. And this is what happened to us, where, we built AI computer vision technologies in completely different sectors in advertising and insurance, and decided to transfer that to the waste management sector. And I think that's formed a lot part of our journey in getting from, prototype to scale, is that in a way we had done that in other industries too. So if I had to advise to entrepreneurs, first is really start with the absolute minimum viable product to prove that, somebody wants it, somebody wants to use it, because too often we build entire technologies, complex systems, and actually the demand is not there or the fit is not there. And so for us, we did very simple demos. So we had, a mobile app that could help people recycle at the beginning. We had, in-house built hardware with, data that we collected by hand in our office, like really like very, very, handmade stuff. But it does get you to a concept that you can explain to people, and you see the reactions. And so for us, it was consistently getting customer feedback. And so that means very simply, we went to, for example, in our case, to recycling conferences, and we went stand by stand, talking to people, understanding their problems, understanding what their needs are, where their challenges are at. And slowly, all that data that we collected and that knowledge kind of brought us to a solution. And then once we were there, we invested a little bit more to kind of a more sophisticated prototype. And that's where grants came in for us as well. So we had some private funding, but we also were able to get Innovate UK grant that helped us to develop kind of that first big prototype. And then we started testing that in facilities. So I would say that was when we kind of started removing the technology risk, right? Does it work? Is it possible? And so that's what we were proving. And once the customers felt, okay, this could work, then we moved into, okay, how do we get ourselves to commercial stage? And so that's when working with multiple customers was very important, because we didn't want to overfit for one customer. So this is also another risk, is that you build a very, very custom solution for one player in the industry, but actually you cannot replicate that, to other players as well. And so we had to start doing pilots probably with 10, 15 customers at the same time. That gave us a diverse enough data pool, a diverse enough input, and then that allowed us to standardize it into a product. And that's when we moved from project to product, and that's a very important transition. And of course, then you build a product. Again, it's a first stage, and then you start getting feedback from the customer, getting their input, getting their feedback, and then you go into this continuous evolution of product iteration. So I would say kind of that was the big stages for us. But at every moment, the underlying thread is customer input, because especially when you're disrupting very complex industries, let's not pretend we know it as deeply as the industry. And so for us, it was, partnerships, co-building, really getting the customer to work with us on what features do they want, what's important to them. And they're very open because they want these solutions. They know they have to get disrupted. So I wouldn't underestimate how much these big companies want to be working with startups to input into their innovation, because at the end of the day, it will serve them.
Great, thank you, Mikela. Just a reminder to everyone that we are taking Q&As. There's quite a few coming in, and we will be moving towards those at any point. And panelists, please, if you do want to jump in and comment on any of the questions, please do so. So, Selina, we just heard from Mikela, and I believe that from my notes, Greyparrot started in early 2019. Selina, the journey for Carbon8 has been a lot longer because it started off obviously, you know, in academia. Can you talk a little bit about that journey, and also like how do you take a technology that's really based within kind of like deep research and science and engineering and commercialize that? It's like, what's that process been like for you?
Yeah, of course. And I think it is important to start off this conversation by acknowledging a lot of disruptive technologies and what we're seeing at the moment stem in some form from a university. And I think that's fantastic. And we're no different. We're a spin out from the University of Greenwich, and to this day still have a really strong relationship with them. And I think that's very key, because we support each other in the growth, because again, it's in their interest for us to be able to scale up. But just like you say, our journey starts about 20 years ago, but that really was initial research. And then it really became about, I think originally, actually, the technology was based on contaminated soils. And if that's where we started, and now we're looking at a mobile modular CCUS plant, that in itself also demonstrates you need to be willing and able to adapt where the technology takes you to make sure it has a market purpose, it has a market fit. And for us, then the key shift as well is if we look at the hard to abate sectors, that's what we're targeting. Cement alone accounts for 8% of global greenhouse gas emissions. So you know that they know they need to do something. And that was a key change for us. So finding the marketplace for the technology, because like Mikela said, a technology for the sake of having one isn't going to get us to where we need to be. And then if I look at, I guess the journey for us really shifted at proof of concept. And that's where we also got some funding. Our first pilot with the container actually was funded by winning a competition, Solutions 2030 by Ontario Centre of Excellence. And that helped us prove that this is beyond the lab. And I think that's the key there, is how do you move beyond the lab to industrial scale? And you need to demonstrate that something like this can work in industry, especially if you're working in an industry that might be traditionally a little hesitant to change, for example, like cement. And after that, you can prove that this thing exists, and that in itself has a lot of value. It doesn't become an idea or a concept anymore. You have a physical container to look at that is doing what it says you told it would do. And that helped us make that shift and become a commercialized company, or that journey out of the lab.
I'd love to follow up on what Selina said and ask you, Mikela, you're both as companies effectively kind of creating sort of new markets, as it were. So how do you think about it in Greyparrot in terms of the way that you approach potential partners, explain the opportunity and gain trust?
So first of all, we try to be very targeted in getting, to the right people. So, going to very specific industry conferences or associations was very important, because you get very quickly to the target customer. And the other thing that helped us a lot is to work with accelerators that have very, very targeted programs to the sector we're trying to tackle. And so, for example, Plug and Play, in collaboration with the Alliance to End Plastic Waste, created an accelerator that gave us access to all the biggest players in the plastic value chain. And that's very important, because there's a signal from both sides. There's a signal from the industry that we want to be meeting innovative companies. We want to find new solutions. And part of their job is that they have to put forward their challenges and their priorities. And of course, we are assessed as viable technologies that might have funding, that might already have credibility, some, a product that's in place. And therefore, that's a filter to them to say, okay, these companies can be taken seriously. And that creates a very good match. So I think I would definitely advise anyone trying to enter a sector to try to find those pockets or those accelerators that can put you in front of companies that want and are sort of actively looking for solutions. And then once you start commercializing, that's a bit different. I would say that's kind of more of a traditional B2B route, where you look at, your market, who are the largest players, who are the first ones you need to play with, what are the most important countries that you need to enter, and start, building a kind of an acquisition plan around that. But in the early stages, I think using the help of those accelerators is very important.
So clearly, Leo, we've heard from Mikela, we've heard from Selina about the importance of kind of like getting to scale, and actually, green tech is only going to be effective if we can scale it. From your perspective, thinking about the report coming out, you've got a view of this ecosystem. How do you think we can best accelerate the funding process so that startups can move much more quickly from early stage to scale?
Yeah, and I think just building on what Mikela said, there's the funding, but the funding's really moving. So clean tech funding has doubled in size since last year. It's now 14 cents in every dollar is going into, in every VC dollar is going into climate tech. But I think that the next real challenge is the scale up, and as Mikela described it, the product market fit. And that's where I think there's a huge opportunity just to get the linkages really strong and tight. So another report that we're launching next week is our Future 50 for the UK, which is looking at 50 really promising, commercially viable, high carbon impact and scalable technologies, of which both Greyparrot and Carbonate are prime examples. And the real question then is, okay, where in the market can you see there's a massive opportunity for an incumbent to partner with these innovators and really make 2 + 2 make 5? And that's where there's some sort of market intelligence that I think is crucial. I'm thinking, if you're in, as an example, if you're an agribusiness and you own a whole load of cows and you can see this weak signal that there's going to be a methane tax, because methane has been big on the agenda. That means, for a major agribusiness client, if they applied the tax at the same level as the Danish have, you're talking about a liability in the billions of euros a year for a major supply chain, which means there's then a huge strategic premium for you to start looking at a startup like Symprosia doing a red algae feedstock that radically takes down methane emissions if you put it into the diet of your cow. So it's that sort of, okay, there's the glimmer of a particular direction of travel where if you're the startup, you could get some people really biting off your hand when you approach them. And we really want to be trying to find these brilliant startups and then help them take out to market the type of transformation they can create.
I'm keen to get some for us to answer some of the questions that are coming in from the attendees today. But just one final question for both Mikela and Selina. Given that it's startups, that, ensuring that you have that runway of capital is so important to your existence. Like, how do you keep focused on your original goals when it's so easy to get into this sort of cycle of trying to raise capital in order to kind of get to where you want to be? Maybe Mikela, you could answer that first, please.
So for us, I think our compass has always been the purpose of the company and why we started. And that's been, really, we're here to create an impact and a positive impact, regardless of what we do. It needs to help reduce emissions, increase recycling. And I think keeping that compass always, in any decision or in any good times or bad times, I think helps a lot. But it also creates a lot of attractiveness, because today, a lot of the talent is also driven by this purpose, right? People want to work for companies that are, of course, going to have a business case and it's a viable business, but they also want to be spending their time on a problem that they really care about, that they feel they're making a difference. And so regardless of, the pressures of commercialization, always keeping that in mind, that at the end of the day, we have to support an industry, we have to reduce emissions. I think that's always been a very helpful support for all of us.
Thank you. Selina, how do you keep your eye on the North Star?
Well, I second what Mikela said, and I think team is definitely a huge element within that. You start off small, but you all have one common goal, and you trust each other's talents to make it happen. So that is definitely a huge also motivating factor for everyone who's within the company. But on top of that, again, I would say we are in this amazing momentum at the moment, following COP, following the acknowledgement, in our case, for example, that carbon capture will have to play a role in some form if we're going to make net zero goals at the time we need to. So that momentum is definitely also fun, like fueling that focus, as well as to make sure we feel like we could help. So let's try and do that. And so I think that definitely does help steer and keep us going as well.
Great, thank you, Selina. So we do have quite a few questions coming in on the Q&A now. If any of the panelists wanted to jump in and say, hey, I'd like to take this particular question because it interests me, please do so. But one that did sort of get my attention was from Elizabeth, and she's asking about the fact that many kind of corporates were involved in COP26, but it didn't feel like startups and VCs had the sort of same presence. Like, how can we ensure, the question is, that the climate tech community and tech innovators and VCs are more kind of integrated into COP27? I don't know if you've got a view on that, maybe, Leo.
That's a good question. I think, showcase the staff and its impact. And I think, get the ecosystem together. I think it's, if you can get the right VC and the right industry players who can really benefit it in the same space and do some sort of challenge-focused, really, really practical sessions on this is what we could do, that I think would be really, really vital.
Great, thank you. Any thoughts on that from Selina and Mikela from a startup point of view?
I mean, I'm happy to jump in first. I think one key thing for COP, from our point of view as well, is COP is one element. The interesting thing is what happens between the COPs. That's where we actually have to action the things we said we would do. And I think from our point of view, that's the exciting moments for us. That's when we get involved and say, right, okay, we as clean tech companies and as an industry, we're starting to have the solutions to these problems to help you reach those pledges. So that's, I guess, my point of view a little bit, is it's the between the COPs that I find so significant. That's where the action happens, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Mikela, any thoughts on that, or is there another question you'd like to take on?
Yeah, I guess probably sort of a side note to all of this is that what's very important is the direction that COPs gives in terms of those commitments, because that means we're gonna need solutions. This is happening, and we're gonna have to invest in that direction. And that comes both from the corporate side, of those commitments, but also we need to have clear direction on the policy side, and that's sometimes what's missing as well. So if we take the waste and resources sector, the new environmental bill is being proposed, is taking a lot of time, and the problem with that is that it doesn't create a lot of commitment from the sector. So I think what would help is, as part of those COPs, is to have very concrete plans, and then but both from the corporate and the government side, because that empowers the investment community and the startup community to really double down on a direction that we know is happening.
And just one final question. Amy is tuning in from, she says, down under. I don't know if that's Australia or New Zealand or somewhere else, but great to have you with us, Amy. And the question she's asking really is around sort of the way that VC works, and the fact that VCs often just sort of, are really sort of thinking about valuations rather than necessarily than kind of the scaling impact. I don't know if you've got any reflections on that, Selina or Mikela, in terms of like, do we need some kind of a mindset shift within VC, or climate tech sort of VCs sort of slightly different from other kinds of VCs?
Yeah, so to jump in there, so there's definitely a very big difference between kind of generalist VCs and climate-focused VCs, because climate-focused VCs will have to report to their LPs, their limited partners, so the people that invest in their fund, both on the financial returns of the fund, but also on the impact returns of the fund. And so that can be, tons of carbon saved. It can be, tons of recycling increased. And so that creates a very, very different KPI for those investment managers to choosing which companies they want to work with, because you have to be aligned both on the financial front, but also on the mission front. For generalist VCs, I would say they're still primarily driven by the financial return. And sometimes it does go together. But of course, when they have to enter a space that is, with hardware, maybe more risky, you're competing with, NFTs and crypto at the same time. So, so the choices are a bit more difficult there. So we have found that working with climate tech focused VCs has been more fruitful. And just to add, sorry, one last point on this is, for all these technologies, for them to be financially viable, I mean, it's important, right? Like, it shouldn't be either or. It is important to be financially viable. But one thing that supports that too is strong policy again. Because, for example, if there's a plastic tax, if there's extended producer responsibility imposing taxes to the packaging producers on their recycling rates, well, that shifts the economic a balance of these companies. And like you said, they're all of a sudden exposed to very big liabilities, and therefore, solutions, innovative solutions make a lot of sense. So I think, again, policy has a very strong role to play in balancing those economical incentives.
Well, thank you so much, the three of you. I feel like we've barely scratched the surface. We can continue this for some time. Please do look out for the Future 50 report that's coming next week. Is it Leo from PwC? Great. Yeah, we'll look out for that. Great. And Mikela and Selina, thank you so much for your time. We're really looking forward to seeing, following the journey of Greyparrot and Carbon8. And we're looking forward to see where you are in the coming years. And let's hope, I imagine, that we can keep the momentum going for the ecosystem to grow further. Thank you so much for joining us, and have a great day, everyone.